What if one simple thought was controlling your entire life? For me, it was this: what will they think? It followed me everywhere, every decision, every word, and I thought it was normal, until one moment changed everything. Hello, and thank you for being here with me today. Before this story begins, I want to ask you something simple, something you may not even realize how often you ask yourself. How often do you think, "What will they think?" before you speak, before you act, before you make a decision? It's such a small question, almost invisible in the moment, but it has a quiet power. It can shape your choices, filter your words, and slowly guide your life without you even noticing. And the truth is that one thought can quietly control everything. I know this because I lived that way for years. I was always thinking, "What will they think?" It wasn't something I said out loud. It wasn't even something I consciously chose. It was just there, in the background of every decision I made. And over time, that thought became a habit. Not just a thought, but a pattern, a way of moving through the world. My name is Kevin, and for most of my life, I didn't live freely. I lived carefully, careful with my words, choosing what to say and what to hold back, careful with my actions, always considering how they might be perceived, careful with how I appeared to others, adjusting myself in small ways so I could fit into what I believed was acceptable, because somewhere inside me, I believed something very strongly. If people judge me, I will lose something important. I didn't fully understand where that belief came from. It wasn't one big moment. It wasn't something anyone clearly told me. It was built slowly, through small experiences. A comment here, a reaction there, a moment of embarrassment, a feeling of being misunderstood. None of these moments were dramatic on their own, but together they formed a quiet rule in my mind. Be careful. Don't stand out too much. Don't say the wrong thing. Don't give people a reason to judge you. At first, this way of thinking felt helpful. It made me more aware, more thoughtful, more cautious. I learned to observe people closely, to understand what was expected, and to adjust myself accordingly. I became good at reading situations, good at saying the right thing at the right time, good at avoiding conflict. From the outside, it looked like I had control, but inside, something else was happening. Because when you are always thinking about what others think, you slowly stop asking yourself what you think. You stop noticing your own preferences, your own opinions, your own voice. Instead of choosing what feels true to you, you choose what feels safe. And for a long time, I didn't question that. I thought this was just what it meant to be responsible, to be mature, to be someone who fits into the world without causing problems. I believed that being careful was the same as being wise, but over time, that carefulness began to feel different. It began to feel like pressure, not loud pressure, not something that demanded attention, but a quiet tension that followed me everywhere. In conversations, I would think twice before speaking, sometimes 3 or 4 times, until the moment passed and I said nothing at all. In decisions, I would hesitate, wondering not what I wanted, but what others might expect from me. Even in simple situations, that thought was there. What will they think? It appeared so quickly, so automatically, that I barely noticed it, but it shaped everything. It shaped how I spoke, how I acted, how I presented myself. It shaped the version of me that the world saw, and slowly, without realizing it, I began to lose something, not something visible, not something others could point to, but something internal, my sense of ease, my sense of freedom, my sense of being myself, without needing to adjust. I became someone who could adapt to almost any situation. But in doing so, I no longer felt completely real in any of them. I could fit in, but I didn't fully belong, not even to myself. And that is the strange thing about living this way. From the outside, everything can look fine. You have conversations. You build relationships. You move forward in life. But inside, there is a quiet distance between who you are and who you show. For a long time, I ignored that distance. I told myself it was normal. I told myself that everyone thinks this way, that everyone worries about being judged. And maybe that's true to some extent. But there is a difference between awareness and control. And that thought was controlling me. I didn't see it clearly at first. It was too familiar, too deeply connected to the way I lived. But there were small moments when something felt off. Moments when I wanted to say something honest, but chose something safer instead. Moments when I wanted to take a step forward, but held back because I wasn't sure how it would be received. Each of those moments was small, but they added up, and over time, those small moments created a pattern, a life lived not by choice, but by caution. And the more I lived that way, the more natural it felt, until I stopped questioning it altogether. But then something happened. Not something dramatic or life-changing in an obvious way. It was a small moment, the kind of moment that most people would forget. But for me, it created a pause, a break in the pattern, a moment where I could finally see what had been guiding me all along. And that's when everything began to change. But before we get there, I want you to think about something again. How often do you stop yourself because of that one thought? How many things have you not said, not done, not tried, simply because you were thinking about what someone else might think? Because the truth is, that thought feels protective. It feels like it's keeping you safe. It's the very thing holding you back. And I didn't realize that until that one moment when I finally saw it clearly. At first, it didn't seem like a problem. In fact, I thought it was something good. I told myself I was being thoughtful, aware, and considerate of others. I believed that thinking carefully before speaking was a sign of maturity, that paying attention to how people might feel was a form of kindness. From the outside, it looked like a strength. I wasn't impulsive. I didn't interrupt. I didn't say things I might regret. I took my time, observed, and chose my words carefully. And for a while, that felt right, but slowly, something began to change. What once felt like awareness started turning into something heavier. It wasn't just thinking anymore. It became overthinking. Before I said anything, I would replay it in my head. Not once, but again and again. I would imagine different versions of the same sentence, adjusting small details, changing words, trying to find the perfect way to say something. And while I was doing that, the moment would pass. The conversation would move on. Someone else would speak, and I would remain silent, holding onto words that never left my mind. At first, I didn't notice how often this was happening. It felt normal. It felt like I was just being careful. But over time, I started to see a pattern. Before I did anything, I would imagine how people would react. Not just one reaction, but many. What if they disagree? What if they misunderstand me? What if they think I'm wrong? What if they think I'm strange? Each question created another layer of hesitation, another reason to pause, another reason to step back. And most of the time, that hesitation stopped me. I avoided speaking up, even when I had something to say. I avoided attention, even when I wanted to be part of the moment. I avoided situations where I might stand out, where people might notice me too much. Because being noticed meant being seen. And being seen, in my mind, meant being judged. That connection felt automatic. If I speak, they will notice. If they notice, they will judge. And if they judge, I might lose something. I didn't always know what that something was. It wasn't clear. It wasn't something I could define. But it felt important. It felt like approval, like acceptance, like belonging. And the idea of losing that, even in a small way, felt uncomfortable. So I chose safety. I chose silence over expression. I chose invisibility over attention. I chose control over risk. And at first, that worked. When you stay quiet, you avoid mistakes. When you don't draw attention, you avoid criticism. When you don't take risks, you avoid failure. Everything feels stable, predictable, and manageable. There are fewer surprises, fewer uncomfortable moments, fewer chances to feel exposed. But there is also something else, something I didn't see right away, because safe also meant small. That realization didn't come all at once. It didn't appear as a clear thought or a sudden insight. It showed up in small moments, almost quietly, the same way my overthinking had started. Moments when I felt like I was on the outside of a conversation, even though I was physically there. Moments when I had something to contribute but chose not to. Moments when I left a situation feeling like I had not fully been myself. At first, I ignored those feelings. I told myself it didn't matter, that not every moment requires you to speak, that it's okay to stay in the background. And in many ways, that's true. But this was different. This wasn't about choosing silence. This was about being controlled by it. The more I paid attention, the more I noticed how often I held myself back. It wasn't just in big situations, but in small, everyday moments. A simple comment I didn't share, a question I didn't ask, a thought I kept to myself because I wasn't sure how it would be received. Each moment seemed insignificant on its own, but together they created a pattern, and that pattern began to shape my life. It was always presented. Someone who listened more than spoke, observed more than acted, and thought more than expressed. I was there, but not entirely. And the strange part was, people still saw me as thoughtful, calm, and easy to be around. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. In fact, it probably looked like I had everything under control, but inside, it felt different, because every time I chose silence out of fear, a part of me stayed hidden. Every time I avoided attention, I also avoided opportunity. Every time I tried to protect myself from judgment, I also prevented myself from being known, and slowly, that started to matter. There is a difference between being quiet and feeling small. Being quiet can be a choice. It can be peaceful, intentional, even powerful. But feeling small is something else. It's the sense that your presence doesn't fully take up space, that your voice doesn't carry weight, that your thoughts remain unspoken, not because you choose it, but because something holds you back. And that was what I began to feel. Not all the time. Not in a way that disrupted everything. but often enough to notice, often enough to question, why am I holding back? What am I afraid of? And is this really protecting me or limiting me? Those questions didn't have immediate answers, but they created something important, a pause, a small space between the thought, what will they think, and the decision I made next. And in that space, I began to see things more clearly. I began to realize that the safety I had built for myself came with a cost. It protected me from judgment, but it also kept me from expression. It reduced risk, but it also reduced growth. It made life predictable, but it also made it smaller. And that was the part I could no longer ignore, because the truth is, avoiding judgment doesn't mean avoiding discomfort. It just changes the type of discomfort you feel. Instead of the discomfort of being seen and possibly misunderstood, you experience the discomfort of not being seen at all. And over time, that second kind of discomfort becomes heavier, quieter, but heavier. That was the moment when something began to shift, not in a dramatic way, not with a clear decision or a sudden change, but in a quieter, more subtle way. I started to notice the cost of staying safe. I started to feel the weight of staying small. And once you see that clearly, even for a moment, it becomes difficult to go back to not noticing. So let me ask you something again. How many times have you stayed silent? Not because you had nothing to say, but because you were thinking about what others might think. How many times have you chosen safety without realizing what it was costing you? Because sometimes what feels like protection is actually a limitation. And I didn't fully understand that until I began to see how small my world had become. The moment everything changed wasn't planned. It didn't arrive as a clear decision or a turning point I could prepare for. It happened unexpectedly, in the middle of an ordinary situation that, at first, felt no different from many others. There was no warning, no sign that anything important was about to happen. And maybe that's why it mattered so much, because it caught me exactly as I was unprepared, uncertain, and still carrying all the habits I had built over the years. I found myself in a situation where I couldn't stay invisible anymore. It wasn't something I chose. It wasn't something I could avoid. Suddenly, all eyes were on me. The attention I had spent so long avoiding was now unavoidable. And in that moment, everything felt different. There was no time to think, no time to prepare, no time to go through the usual process in my mind, the one where I replayed every word, imagined every reaction, and adjusted myself until I felt safe enough to act. That process, which had always been there, which had always guided me, simply didn't have time to appear. There was only one moment, one choice, and for the first time, I didn't have the option to hide. That realization came quickly, almost instantly. It wasn't something I analyzed. It was something I felt. The familiar path, silence, hesitation, stepping back, was no longer available. And without that option, something else had to take its place. So I spoke, not because I felt ready, but because I had no other choice. The words came out before I could fully shape them, before I could adjust them to fit what I thought others might expect. They were not perfect. There were small pauses, slight hesitations, moments where I searched for the right way to continue. But I kept going. I acted. I responded to the situation in front of me instead of the imagined reactions in my mind. I focused on what was happening, not on what might happen afterward. It felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, like stepping into something without knowing how it would unfold. I showed up, not perfectly, not confidently, but honestly, and that honesty was different from anything I had experienced before. It wasn't controlled or carefully constructed. It wasn't shaped to avoid judgment. It was simply real. And then something surprising happened. Nothing. No one laughed. No one reacted with the kind of judgment I had feared for so long. No one looked at me with the kind of criticism I had imagined in my mind countless times. The room didn't change. The people didn't change. Everything continued as it always had, but inside me something shifted, because for years I had built an entire system in my mind based on what I thought would happen if I spoke freely, if I acted without overthinking, if I allowed myself to be seen. I had imagined reactions, judgments, and consequences. I had created a version of reality that felt real enough to control my behavior. But in that moment, none of those imagined outcomes appeared, and in that absence, something became clear. The fear I had been living with was not based on what actually happened. It was based on what I thought might happen. That realization didn't come as a dramatic insight. It came quietly, almost gently, but it carried weight. It wasn't just about that one moment. It was about everything that had come before it. All the times I had stayed silent, all the times I had held back, all the moments I had chosen safety over expression. I began to see them differently, not as necessary, not as protection, but as decisions shaped by something that wasn't entirely real. That thought, "What will they think?" had felt powerful for so long. It had guided me, limited me, and defined the way I moved through the world. But now, for the first time, I saw it for what it was, a possibility, not a certainty. And that changed everything. Because if it were only a possibility, then it didn't have to control me. It didn't have to decide my actions before I even had the chance to act. It didn't have to stop me before I even began. For the first time, I experienced something different. Not confidence, not immediately, not a complete absence of fear, but something quieter, space. A small space between the thought and the action. A space where I could choose. That space had always existed, but I had never noticed it before. I had moved so quickly from thought to hesitation, from hesitation to silence, that I never realized there was another option. But now I could see it. And once you see something like that, even for a moment, it's difficult to go back to not seeing it. That moment didn't transform me instantly. I didn't suddenly become someone who spoke without thinking or acted without hesitation. The habits I had built didn't disappear in a single experience, but something had changed. The certainty was gone. The belief that I had to be perfect before speaking, that I had to be sure before acting, that I had to protect myself from every possible judgment. Belief no longer felt as strong, because I had seen what actually happens, and what actually happens is often much simpler than what we imagine. People continue with their day. Conversations move forward. Moments pass. And most of the time, the reactions we fear never come. That doesn't mean there is no judgment in the world. Of course there is. People have opinions. They notice things. They react. But it is not as constant, not as intense, and not as defining as we often imagine. And more importantly, it is not something we can fully control for so long. I had tried to control something that was never fully in my control. I had shaped myself around imagined reactions, trying to avoid something that might not even happen. But in doing that, I had limited something that was completely within my control: my ability to show up, my ability to speak, my ability to be present in my own life. And that was the part that mattered most. So let me ask you something. Again, how many times have you stopped yourself? Not because you couldn't do something, but because you were thinking about what might happen if you did. How many moments have you let pass because you were waiting to feel ready, to feel certain, to feel safe? Because the truth is, there are moments in life where you won't have time to think, no time to prepare, no time to overanalyze, just one moment, one choice, and in that moment, you will either step forward or stay where you are. I spent years staying where I was, but that moment showed me something different: that you don't need to be perfect to show up. You don't need to be confident to speak. You don't need to eliminate fear before you act. Sometimes all you need is to stop hiding, and when you do, you may realize something surprising: that the world you were afraid of is not the same as the one you imagined. I had spent years being afraid of something that, in the end, wasn't even real. Not completely real, at least. It felt real in my mind, strong enough to guide my choices and limit my actions. But when I finally stepped outside of it, when I finally experienced a moment without that constant filter, I saw it differently. People weren't watching me that closely. They weren't analyzing every word I said, replaying my sentences the way I did in my own head. They weren't judging every move, noticing every small mistake, or holding on to every imperfect moment. Most people were too busy thinking about themselves, their own concerns, their own insecurities, their own lives. That realization didn't come as a loud discovery. It didn't feel dramatic or overwhelming. It felt quiet, simple, almost obvious, as if it had always been there, waiting for me to notice it. And yet, it changed something important inside me, because for the first time, I understood something that had been hidden behind years of overthinking. Nobody cares as much as you think at first. That idea might sound uncomfortable. It might even feel disappointing. We often want to believe that people are paying attention, that they are noticing us, that our actions matter visibly. But what I realized was something different. It's not a bad thing, in fact. It's one of the most freeing things you can understand. Because if people are not watching you that closely, if they are not analyzing every detail, if they are not judging every step you take, then something else becomes possible. You are free. Free to speak without needing to be perfect. Free to try without needing to guarantee success. Free to make mistakes without believing they define you. Free to be yourself without constantly adjusting to fit into someone else's expectations. That freedom had always been there. It wasn't something I needed to earn or create. It was something I had been overlooking, something I had been blocking with my own thoughts. For years, I had been asking the same question: what will they think? And that question had shaped everything. It had influenced my words, my actions, my decisions, and even my sense of identity. It had created boundaries where none truly existed. It had turned simple moments into complicated ones, and opportunities into risks. But after that moment, After I saw how different reality was from what I had imagined, something began to shift. I didn't become fearless. That would be unrealistic. Fear doesn't disappear instantly, especially when it has been part of your life for so long. It still appeared, still whispered the same familiar questions, still tried to pull me back into old patterns. But it felt different. It felt smaller, less convincing, less powerful, and I became something else, less afraid. That change was not dramatic. It didn't transform everything overnight, but it was enough. Enough to create space. Enough to allow a different response. Enough to interrupt the automatic pattern that had guided me for years. Instead of immediately asking, "What will they think?" I began to notice another question. What do I want? At first, that question felt unfamiliar. It didn't come as naturally. I wasn't used to asking it. For so long, my focus had been outward, directed toward others, shaped by imagined reactions. Turning that focus inward felt different, almost uncomfortable at times. But it was also necessary, because when you start asking what you want, you begin to reconnect with something you may have ignored for a long time. Your preferences, your thoughts, your voice, and that changes the way you move through the world. Decisions become less about avoiding judgment and more about choosing what feels right. Conversations become less about saying the correct thing and more about expressing something real. Actions become less about controlling outcomes and more about participating fully in the moment. It doesn't mean you stop caring about others. It doesn't mean you ignore how your actions affect people. It simply means that your life is no longer controlled by imagined reactions. And that is a powerful shift, because for so long, I had been living in a version of reality shaped by fear. Not fear of something that was actually happening, but fear of something that might happen. A possibility repeated so many times in my mind that it felt like a certainty. But when that illusion broke, when I saw that most of those imagined reactions never appeared, I realized how much I had been holding myself back. How many things had I not said? How many opportunities had I not taken? How many moments had I not fully experienced? Not because I couldn't, but because I was thinking about what others might think. That realization didn't bring regretfully or overwhelmingly. Instead, it brought clarity. Because if that thought had been limiting me, then letting it go, even slightly, could open something new. And it did. Small changes began to appear. I spoke a little more, even when I wasn't completely sure. I shared my thoughts, even when they weren't perfectly formed. I took small actions without waiting for complete confidence, and each time I saw the same thing. The world didn't react the way I had feared. People listened, or they didn't, but life continued. Conversations moved forward. Moments passed, and nothing collapsed because I had chosen to be a little more visible. That repetition reinforced something important. The fear was not as powerful as I had believed. And once you see that clearly, even a few times, it becomes easier to act despite it. So if you've been living your life controlled by that one question, if you've been holding yourself back because of what you think others might think, maybe it's time to pause, not to eliminate the thought completely, not to force yourself into something uncomfortable, but simply to notice it, to see it for what it is, a thought, not a rule, not a certainty, and then, slowly, to introduce another question. What do I want? Because that question leads you somewhere different. It leads you toward yourself, toward a life that feels more real, more present, more aligned with who you are. And maybe, just maybe, it leads you to something you've been waiting for without even realizing it. Freedom, not the kind of freedom that removes all fear, but the kind that allows you to move forward anyway. Because the life you want is not on the other side of perfection. It's not waiting for you to feel completely ready. It's waiting on the other side of that fear. And sometimes all it takes to begin is to stop asking what they will think and start asking what you truly want. Before we end this story, I want you to pause for a moment. Think about how many times you stopped yourself just because of one thought. What will they think? How many words you didn't say? How many chances you didn't take? How many versions of yourself you are never allowed to exist, not because you couldn't, but because you were afraid. But now you know something different. People are not watching you that closely. They are not analyzing every step. They are not judging every word. Most of them, they are thinking about themselves, just like you were. And that means something powerful. You are free, not when fear disappears, but when you stop letting it decide. So next time that thought appears again, what will they think? Don't fight it. Just ask something better. What do I want? Because your life doesn't change when people start noticing you. It changes the moment you stop hiding. And if you're still here, still listening, maybe this is your moment. Not to be perfect, not to be confident, but simply to be real. Stay with me, because this is not just one story. This is where you learn English and slowly learn to become yourself. Another story is waiting for you.